It started not with an argument or a screaming match, but with a laugh. I am Imani, and at 34 years old, I had spent the last decade building a top-tier financial security firm in Atlanta. I thought my life was perfectly secure, especially my 10-year marriage to my husband Marcus. He was a senior director at a venture capital fund, sharp, charismatic, and supposedly my biggest supporter. But that illusion shattered completely on a quiet Tuesday evening. I had accidentally left my phone recording in his home office after using it to dictate some project notes earlier that day. When I retrieved it and pressed play, hoping to catch where I left off, I did not hear my own voice. I heard Marcus. And then I heard another voice joining him in a low, mocking chuckle. It was Sarah, the white wife of his younger brother David. They were not just talking, they were laughing about me. They were laughing as they detailed a meticulous plan to drain my company assets, filter my retirement accounts through offshore shells, and frame me for tax fraud. They thought I was completely oblivious. They thought the tech CEO was too busy loving her husband to notice the knife he was pressing into her back. Sitting there in the dark living room with their voices playing through my headphones, I did not cry. 10 years of marriage, of building a home and a life together, crumbled into dust right in front of me, but not a single tear fell. Instead, a cold and absolute calmness washed over my entire body. They thought I was a fool they could easily discard. They had no idea that my silence was not ignorance. It was preparation. I decided right then and there that I would not just protect myself. I was going to take back every single thing they planned to steal and leave them with absolutely nothing. Before I share exactly how I destroyed their lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to look a betrayer in the eye and smile while secretly plotting their downfall. The betrayal cut deeper because of how picture-perfect we looked to the outside world. We lived in a stunning modern estate in Buckhead, surrounded by other affluent African-American professionals. To everyone else, Marcus and I were the ultimate power couple, hosting charity galas and mentoring young entrepreneurs. But behind the imported mahogany doors and the designer furnishings, my reality had just become a psychological war zone. I knew I had to act normal. I had to sleep next to the man who was actively conspiring to ruin my life, and I had to smile at family dinners with the woman who was helping him do it. The game had officially changed, and I was ready to play. 2 days later, we were seated in a private dining room at one of the most exclusive restaurants in Midtown Atlanta, celebrating my 34th birthday. The ambiance was pure luxury. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the long mahogany table, while a private sommelier poured vintage champagne into delicate fluted glasses. Our family and closest friends were gathered around us, a sea of tailored designer suits and custom silk dresses. To anyone looking through the floor-to-ceiling glass doors, we were the very picture of Black excellence and familial devotion. I sat at the head of the table wearing a fitted emerald gown, playing the role of the radiant birthday girl to absolute perfection. Marcus sat right beside me, holding my hand under the heavy linen tablecloth. His thumb rubbed soothing circles across my knuckles, exactly the way he had done since our college days. He leaned over, brushing his lips against my ear, and whispered that I looked absolutely breathtaking tonight. The warmth in his voice was so convincing, so perfectly modulated, that for a fraction of a second, my heart betrayed me and fluttered with familiar affection. Then my mind snapped back to reality. I remembered the recording. I remembered that exact same voice, laughing with another woman about how easily he was going to drain my business accounts and leave me with nothing but tax liabilities. I smiled back at him, squeezing his hand gently, letting him believe his masterful performance was working flawlessly. Across the table, David laughed at a joke someone made, completely oblivious to the dynamics shifting around him. David was Marcus's younger brother, a man who had always lived comfortably in Marcus's shadow. He was sweet, but entirely passive, relying heavily on both my husband and his own wife to make his decisions. Next to him sat Sarah. She wore a pristine white dress that contrasted sharply with her dark, calculating nature. She was busy playing the perfect supportive sister-in-law, chatting amicably with my mother, and pouring water for the guests. Every time she looked at Marcus, I caught the micro-expressions, the brief, lingering glances, the subtle shifts in her posture. If I had not heard the recording, I would have never noticed them. But now those small details were glaringly obvious, red flags flashing right in front of my face. When the dessert course was served, Marcus stood up and gently tapped his silver spoon against his crystal champagne glass. The room quieted down immediately, turning their attention to the man of the hour. Marcus looked down at me with an expression of such profound adoration that it genuinely made my stomach turn. He began to speak, his voice projecting confidently to our guests. He talked about my dedication, my brilliance, and how he had watched me build my technology security firm from a tiny startup into an industry powerhouse. He called me his queen, his anchor, and the undisputed love of his life. He told our friends that every successful man needs a stronger woman standing beside him. Every single word was a calculated performance designed to maintain his pristine public image as the ultimate supportive husband. Then he reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek black velvet box. The room erupted in soft gasps of anticipation as he popped it open to reveal a stunning diamond necklace. The stones caught the ambient light, dazzling and completely flawless. He stepped behind my chair, unclasped the delicate jewelry, and gently placed it around my neck. The diamonds felt like solid ice against my skin, cold and heavy, like a chain he was slowly tightening around my throat. He leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to my bare shoulder, whispering, "Happy birthday, my love," for everyone to hear. The crowd clapped and cheered, raising their glasses in our honor. I reached up to touch the diamonds, pasting a look of overwhelming gratitude and joyful surprise on my face. "Thank you, baby," I said, making sure my voice trembled just enough to sound deeply moved by his gesture. That was when Sarah decided it was her turn to take the stage. She stood up from her seat next to David, lifting her glass high, with a bright and beaming smile plastered across her face. "I would like to propose a toast," she announced, her voice ringing clear and melodious across the dining room. "To Imani and Marcus. Looking at you two tonight reminds us all of what true partnership really means. You support each other, you build each other up, and you show us that true love can conquer any obstacle in the corporate world and beyond. Here is to the strongest couple I know and to many more years of health, wealth, and unbroken happiness." "Hear, hear," echoed around the table as glasses clinked together in a chorus of celebration. David looked up at his wife with blind affection, completely unaware that the woman standing beside him was sharing a bed with his own brother. I raised my own glass and locked eyes directly with Sarah across the table. Her smile did not waver for a second, but there was a distinct glint in her eyes, a subtle arrogance of a predator who firmly believes she has won the ultimate prize. She was toasting to my wealth while actively plotting to steal it. She was drinking to the longevity of my marriage while secretly dismantling it behind closed doors. The sheer audacity of her standing there praising my partnership with Marcus while knowing exactly what they had planned for me was staggering. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne, never breaking eye contact with her. The vintage wine tasted bitter on my tongue, but I kept the soft, appreciative smile firmly on my face. My mind was racing, replaying the audio file I had memorized by heart. I remembered Sarah suggesting they use a specific shell company in the Cayman Islands to hide the assets they planned to strip from my firm. I remembered Marcus agreeing, calling her brilliant, and promising her that they would be celebrating together in Paris by next summer. And here they were, currently surrounding me with expensive gifts and public declarations of loyalty, wrapping their treacherous betrayal in velvet boxes and sparkling champagne toasts. They were so utterly confident in their deception. They truly believed they were the smartest people in the room playing a high-stakes game of chess, while I was completely blindfolded and stumbling in the dark. But as the dinner continued and the loud laughter flowed around me, my internal resolve only hardened into steel. I decided to let them have their grand performance tonight. Let them drink the expensive wine and wear their fake smiles. They were celebrating a victory they had not yet won and counting money that was never going to belong to them. I touched the cold diamonds resting on my collarbone and made a silent, unbreakable vow. I was going to let them build this fragile house of cards as high as possible. I would play the loving, oblivious wife flawlessly until the very last second. And when the timing was absolutely perfect, I would not just knock their house of cards down. I would set it on fire, lock the doors, and watch them scramble in the ashes. The grand birthday celebration eventually wound down, leaving us to return to the quiet isolation of our Buckhead estate. Marcus had consumed just enough vintage scotch to ensure a heavy, deep sleep. I lay perfectly still in our custom king-sized bed, listening to the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of his breathing. The expensive diamond necklace he had clasped around my throat just hours ago now sat on my vanity, catching the faint moonlight filtering through the curtains. I waited until the house was entirely silent, until the digital clock on my nightstand flashed 2 in the morning. Then I slowly slid out from under the heavy silk duvet. My bare feet hit the cold hardwood floor, but I barely registered the chill. I moved through the dark hallways of our home like a ghost, floating silently past the framed wedding photos and the expensive artwork we had chosen together. I did not turn on a single light. I navigated the familiar layout purely by memory until I reached the heavy oak door of his home office. I slipped inside and locked the door behind me. The room was pitch black except for the faint ambient light from the street lamps outside. I sat down in his leather ergonomic chair and powered on his personal laptop. The screen flickered to life, casting a harsh, bluish-white glow across my face. If anyone had been in the room to see me, they would have found a woman entirely devoid of expression. My features were completely blank, a mask of frozen stone. Marcus was a senior director at a venture capital fund, and he considered himself a master of security. He used complex biometric locks, two-factor authentications, and rotating encryption keys, but he had forgotten one crucial detail. He was married to the founder and chief executive officer of a top-tier technology security firm. I did not just use cybersecurity software, I built it from the ground up. Bypassing his defenses took me exactly 12 minutes. As I breached the final firewall and gained full administrative access to his personal hard drive, a chilling realization washed over me. He lied to me about our vows. He lied to me about our late-night conversations. He lied to me about his late nights at the corporate office. He lied to me about his devotion. He lied to me about love. He lied to me about money. He lied to me about absolutely everything. The words echoed in my mind like a rhythmic drumbeat syncing with the steady clicking of my fingers on his keyboard. Every file I opened, every hidden folder I unencrypted was another nail driven deep into the coffin of our 10-year marriage. I found the offshore accounts first. They were buried under a labyrinth of shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands and the British Virgin Islands. The primary holding company was registered under a name that made my blood run ice cold. It was an anagram of Sarah's maiden name combined with his middle name. They were not even trying to be fully untraceable. They were just arrogant. I opened the digital ledgers and tracked the flow of money. For the past 14 months, Marcus had been slowly, systematically draining funds from our joint investment portfolios. He was careful taking amounts just under the threshold that would trigger an automatic alert from our wealth manager. He was bleeding our shared assets dry and funneling the capital directly into the offshore shell company. He lied to me about our financial goals. He lied to me about his bonuses. He lied to me about the market downturns he claimed had impacted our portfolio. He lied to me about love. He lied to me about money. He lied to me about everything. I dug deeper, routing my search through his archived emails and hidden communication channels. That was when I found the blueprints for my destruction. Marcus and Sarah were not just stealing my personal wealth. They were actively plotting a hostile takeover of my company. Sarah, with her background as an independent financial advisor, had mapped out a strategy to short the stock of my security firm. They had drafted fraudulent documents designed to make it look like I was embezzling company funds and evading federal taxes. They planned to leak these fabricated documents to the board of directors and the federal authorities simultaneously. The goal was to force me out in a catastrophic public scandal, tank the company valuation, and then have Marcus step in as the concerned husband holding power of attorney to sell off my patents for pennies on the dollar. I sat in the dark reading the exact emails where they laughed about my blind trust in him. I read messages where Sarah called me a workaholic fool who was too busy writing code to realize her empire was being stolen from right under her nose. I read Marcus's replies where he agreed with her, promising her that I would be left completely destitute, facing federal prison time, while they enjoyed the spoils of my lifelong hard work. The sheer calculated malice of their plan was breathtaking. They did not just want to leave me. They wanted to destroy me. They wanted to strip away my dignity, my reputation, and my freedom. He lied to me about his pride in my achievements. He lied to me about his respect for my intellect. He lied to me about being my partner in life. He lied to me about love. He lied to me about money. He lied to me about everything. I did not shed a single tear. The woman who had loved Marcus, the woman who had stood beside him at the altar and promised him, forever died right there in that dark office, illuminated only by the harsh glare of his laptop screen. In her place, a completely different person emerged. A woman made of absolute logic and unyielding vengeance. I pulled a secure encrypted flash drive from my pocket and inserted it into the computer. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I initiated a massive data transfer. I copied every single bank record, every offshore wire receipt, every fraudulent document, and every incriminating email. I mirrored his entire hard drive, creating a perfect, pristine copy of his betrayal. I watched the progress bar slowly fill, downloading the evidence that would soon become his ultimate undoing. The silence of the house was profound, broken only by the faint hum of the computer processor. I thought about the man sleeping upstairs in my bed. I thought about the elaborate birthday dinner he had just hosted, the expensive champagne, the diamond necklace, and the flawless performance he had given to our friends and family. He was a sociopath, wrapping his greed in the guise of a loving husband. But he had made a fatal miscalculation. He had brought a knife to a war against a woman who built fortresses for a living. He lied to me about his character. He lied to me about his soul. He lied to me about his humanity. He lied to me about love. He lied to me about money. He lied to me about everything. When the data transfer was 100% complete, I safely ejected the flash drive and slipped it back into my pocket. I carefully erased all digital footprints of my intrusion, leaving the system logs looking exactly as they had before I bypassed them. I powered down the laptop and sat in the pitch-black office for one final moment, letting the darkness envelop me. I had everything I needed. The trap they had spent 14 months setting for me was now entirely in my hands. I stood up, unlocked the office door, and walked silently back down the hallway. When I slid back into our bed, Marcus shifted slightly, his arm reaching out blindly in his sleep to drape heavily across my waist. I did not flinch. I did not pull away. I lay there staring up at the dark ceiling, feeling the cold metal of the flash drive hidden safely inside my silk pajama pocket. My breathing matched his slow calm and perfectly controlled. The midnight investigation was over. The execution phase was about to begin. The morning sun crested over the Atlanta skyline, casting a warm, deceptive light across our bedroom. When Marcus finally stirred, I was already dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, sipping my black coffee and reviewing a digital tablet. I watched him stretch his muscles, rippling under the high thread count sheets, playing the part of the handsome, devoted husband waking up to his successful wife. He smiled at me, a lazy, affectionate grin that made my stomach churn with physical revulsion. I smiled back. I walked over to the bed, leaned down, and pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead, telling him to have a wonderful day at the fund. My voice did not shake. My hands did not tremble. The flash drive containing the blueprint of my utter destruction was already locked securely inside a biometric safe hidden behind my closet mirror. As soon as Marcus drove his imported sports car out of our gated driveway, I headed straight to my company headquarters. I did not go to my corner office on the top floor. Instead, I bypassed the executive suites and took the private elevator down to the sub-level server room. This was my sanctuary, a heavily air-conditioned windowless bunker where my most sensitive security architecture was developed. I locked the reinforced steel door behind me, disabled the internal surveillance cameras, and booted up an isolated air-gapped terminal that was completely disconnected from any external networks. I plugged in the flash drive. It was time to dissect the monster hiding under my marriage. I spent the next 6 hours doing what I do best. I analyzed the data. I traced the digital footprints, stripping away the layers of encryption Marcus and Sarah thought were so clever. The deeper I dug into the Cayman Islands shell company, the more the sheer scale of their depravity came into focus. The offshore entity was registered under the name Meridian Apex Holdings. It was a masterclass in forensic obfuscation, designed by someone who knew exactly how to exploit international tax loopholes. That was Sarah. She was a financial advisor who prided herself on aggressively optimizing wealth for high-net-worth clients. I could see her fingerprints all over the routing numbers and the complex web of dummy corporations acting as buffers. Marcus had provided the initial capital by bleeding our joint accounts, but Sarah was the architect of the financial plumbing. But the stolen cash was just the appetizer. The main course, the true objective of their partnership, was entirely focused on my life work. I opened a subfolder containing encrypted brokerage statements linked to Meridian Apex. When I decrypted the files and saw the trading positions they had taken, my breath hitched in my throat. They were not just planning to ruin my reputation with the fake embezzlement scandal. They were actively short-selling the stock of my technology security firm. For a moment, I sat frozen in the hum of the server room, processing the absolute ruthlessness of their strategy. Short selling is a mechanism where investors bet against a company. You borrow shares, you sell them at the current high price, and you wait for the stock to crash. When the price hits rock bottom, you buy the shares back for pennies, return them to the lender, and pocket the massive difference. Marcus and Sarah had leveraged every stolen dollar from our joint accounts to secure massive short positions against my company. The pieces of the puzzle locked together with sickening clarity. The fabricated documents I had found the night before were designed to frame me for massive corporate tax fraud and the embezzlement of client funds. They planned to leak those documents to the federal authorities and the financial press simultaneously. The moment the news broke, the stock price of my company would plummet to zero. My board of directors would panic and force me out. I would be facing federal indictments, public humiliation, and total bankruptcy. Meanwhile, Marcus and Sarah would be sitting safely behind the shield of Meridian Apex Holdings, watching my stock crash and cashing out tens of millions of dollars in untraceable offshore profits. Marcus would then play the devastated but supportive husband, stepping in to manage my remaining ruined assets while I sat in a federal prison cell. It was a flawless execution of greed. It was a corporate assassination masked as a tragedy. They had weaponized my marriage. They had weaponized my trust. They had weaponized the very empire I had spent 10 years building from scratch. I leaned back in the cold metal chair, staring at the scrolling numbers on the screen. Most people in my position would have completely lost their minds. Most women would have printed these documents, driven straight to the venture capital fund where Marcus worked, and thrown them in his face. They would have screamed. They would have cried. They would have demanded answers. They would have hired high-priced divorce attorneys and immediately filed for emergency injunctions to freeze the assets. But I am not most women. I am a security architect. I understand that when you discover a malicious virus in your network, you do not immediately delete it. If you delete it, the hacker knows you have found them, and they simply rewrite the code and attack you from a different, unseen angle. You quarantine the virus, you study it, you let it run in a controlled environment while you quietly build a trap that will completely destroy the source of the infection. If I confronted Marcus now, it would be a messy, chaotic war. He would deny everything. He would use his powerful connections in the financial sector to bury the evidence. Sarah would quickly liquidate the Cayman accounts and scramble the routing numbers before any subpoena could reach international jurisdictions. I would spend the next 5 years of my life tied up in grueling litigation, fighting a war of attrition against a man who knew all my vulnerabilities. I would be fighting to protect my assets while dealing with the public humiliation of being the betrayed wife. I refused to be the victim in their story. I refused to let them dictate the terms of my survival. I looked at the short positions they had taken against my company. They were heavily leveraged, meaning they had borrowed massive amounts of money on margin to maximize their potential profits. They were betting everything on the absolute certainty that my company would collapse. They were greedy, and greed makes people blind. I made a decision right then in the freezing server room. I would not confront Marcus. I would not scream. I would not cry. I would not pack my bags, and I would not kick him out of our home. I was going to give him exactly what he wanted. I would play the perfect, trusting, naive wife. I would let him continue to funnel money into the offshore accounts. I would let Sarah continue to build their massive short positions against my stock. I would encourage them to get as comfortable and as confident as possible. I would let them stand on the very edge of their imaginary victory. But I was going to secretly rewire the entire financial structure beneath their feet. I was going to construct a digital trap so sophisticated, so legally airtight, that by the time they realized the floor was giving way, they would already be in a free fall. I would use their own momentum, their own fraudulent signatures, and their own offshore accounts to orchestrate their absolute destruction. They wanted to play a high-stakes game with my life. I was going to let them play, but I was going to rewrite the rules of the game so that their only possible exit strategy was federal prison. I pulled the flash drive from the terminal, locked it back in my briefcase, and walked out of the server room. The mourning period for my marriage was officially over. It was time to go to war. It took exactly 4 days for Marcus to make his next move. I had spent those 96 hours playing the role of the exhausted but devoted executive wife. I complained about board meetings. I let my shoulders slump when I walked through our front door. I allowed him to pour my wine and massage my neck while I practically purred with manufactured gratitude. On a rainy Friday evening, the trap was finally set right on our kitchen island. Marcus walked in holding a thick manila folder bearing the embossed logo of his venture capital firm. He wore a crisp navy suit, his tie slightly loosened, projecting the image of a man working tirelessly for our shared future. He slid the folder across the polished marble countertop toward me. Inside was a stack of legal documents thicker than a telephone directory. He poured us both a glass of Cabernet Sauvignon and leaned against the counter, watching me with an expression of deep manufactured concern. "I have been talking with Sarah about our long-term tax strategies," he began, his voice smooth and reassuring. "With your company scaling so rapidly, you are dangerously exposed to federal liabilities. We want to restructure your holding assets to protect you. This is a merger protocol that will shield your personal wealth from any corporate audits. It is just a proactive measure, baby, to make sure no one can ever touch what you have built." I looked down at the dense stack of papers. To the untrained eye, it looked exactly like what he claimed it was standard corporate restructuring. But I did not have an untrained eye. I had already read the digital blueprints of this exact document on his encrypted hard drive. I knew precisely what these pages contained. Hidden beneath layers of complex financial legalese were specific indemnity clauses and liability transfers. If I signed my name on the dotted line, I would be legally acknowledging Meridian Apex Holdings, the offshore shell company they were using to short my stock, as a subsidiary of my own enterprise. It was a brilliantly constructed poison apple. The moment I signed, I would be officially tying my personal tax identification number to their massive financial fraud. I would become the sole legal owner of all the illicit debt they were accumulating, while having absolutely zero access to the actual stolen capital. When the federal authorities inevitably came knocking, looking for the missing millions. This document would serve as my signed confession. It was the smoking gun they needed to guarantee my trip to a federal penitentiary. I could see Sarah's distinct financial fingerprints all over the phrasing. She had structured the liability so that even my best corporate lawyers would struggle to untangle the mess before my company collapsed. I slowly turned the pages, pretending to scan the complex legal jargon, while my mind meticulously cataloged every lethal clause. I could feel his eyes on me, tracking my every movement. I knew he was holding his breath, waiting to see if his brilliant tech CEO wife would spot the financial landmines he had planted. The tension radiating from him was almost palpable. I let out a long, heavy sigh and rubbed my temples, mirroring the exact body language of a woman completely overwhelmed by corporate fatigue. I closed the folder and pushed it back across the marble counter. I looked up at him, letting my eyes soften with exhaustion and overwhelming gratitude. "You know I hate reading this legal jargon," I said, my voice dropping to a soft, tired murmur. "It all just looks like a foreign language to me. I do not know how you and Sarah deal with this every single day." Marcus let out a breath he had clearly been holding. He walked around the kitchen island and pulled me into a warm, protective embrace. He kissed the top of my head, resting his chin on my hair. "That is why you have me," he whispered smoothly. "You focus on changing the tech industry and building your empire. Let me handle the boring financial paperwork. I just want to keep you safe. Sarah already reviewed everything, and she says it is bulletproof. All you need to do is sign the last page, and I will have my team expedite the filing before the end of the fiscal quarter." The sheer audacity of using Sarah's name as a guarantee of safety almost made me break character. They were so incredibly bold. They truly believed my love for him had completely blinded my intellect. I wrapped my arms around his waist, resting my cheek against his chest. I could hear his heartbeat steady and calm. He felt no guilt. He felt no remorse. He was casually handing me a loaded weapon and asking me to pull the trigger on myself. "I will sign it," I said, keeping my tone light and compliant. "But you know how strict my compliance officers are? I have to let my internal legal team log the physical document into our corporate registry first, just a standard protocol so the board does not throw a fit about undocumented restructuring. I will take it to the office on Monday, log it into the system, and sign it right there. You can pick it up from me at dinner." I felt a momentary spike of tension in his chest, a microscopic hesitation. This was not part of his perfect plan. He wanted the signature right now. He wanted the trap locked and loaded before the weekend was over. But he was a master manipulator, and he knew that pushing too hard right now would raise unnecessary suspicion. I had given him a perfectly logical corporate excuse that he could not argue with without sounding desperate. "Of course, baby," he agreed, kissing my forehead again. "Whatever keeps the board happy. Just make sure you do not leave it lying around the office. It has all our personal financial data in it." I promised I would guard it with my life. I picked up the manila folder, holding it carefully against my chest. It felt heavy with malice and betrayal. Marcus smiled, raising his glass of wine to toast our future. I smiled back, clinking my glass against his. He thought he had successfully handed me the instrument of my own demise. He did not realize that by giving me physical possession of this contract, he had just handed me the exact tool I needed to execute his absolute destruction. The poisoned documents were safely in my hands, and I knew exactly how to make him swallow the venom himself. Monday morning arrived with a torrential downpour, washing the Atlanta streets clean. I kissed Marcus goodbye, holding the manila folder tightly against my chest. I watched his sports car disappear down the street before I got into my own vehicle. I did not drive to my corporate headquarters. I did not go to log the documents into my company registry. I drove in the exact opposite direction, heading toward a dilapidated diner on the outskirts of the city. It was the kind of place where billionaires never ventured and where secrets could be exchanged over cheap black coffee. Waiting for me in a back booth was Special Agent Vance Carter of the Securities and Exchange Commission. I had reached out to him through an encrypted channel over the weekend using a backdoor contact I had established years ago when building financial firewalls for government contractors. He was a man who lived for taking down corrupt Wall Street executives. I slid into the vinyl booth across from him, setting my briefcase on the sticky table. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I pulled out a secure tablet disconnected from all cellular networks and pushed it across the table. I watched his eyes scan the screen. I had provided him with a highly curated sample of the data I extracted from Marcus and his encrypted hard drive. I showed him the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I showed him the massive short positions against my company. But most importantly, I showed him the digital signatures connecting Sarah and Marcus to the senior partners at the venture capital fund. This was not an isolated betrayal. The entire firm was running an aggressive insider trading syndicate, using their clients' capital to manipulate the market. Agent Carter looked up from the tablet, his expression completely transformed. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He was looking at the biggest financial bust of his career. He asked me what I wanted in exchange for the full, unredacted data dump. He assumed I wanted witness protection or a plea deal. He underestimated me. I looked him dead in the eye and laid out my terms. I did not want protection. I did not want to hide. I wanted absolute and total immunity for my company. I demanded a legally binding agreement signed by the director of the SEC, guaranteeing that my security firm would not be audited, targeted, or frozen during their investigation. I demanded immunity for my board. I demanded immunity for my shareholders. I demanded immunity for my legacy. My business would remain completely untouched. My reputation would remain pristine. My empire would not suffer a single scratch from the fallout of my husband's crimes. I told him I would serve as the ultimate bait. I would take the fraudulent merger documents Marcus had given me, and I would sign them. But I would not sign the originals. I would sign a digitally altered version that I had carefully reconstructed over the weekend. I would hand Marcus the trigger to his own trap. I would let him and Sarah execute their short sales strategy. I would let them transfer the funds. I would let them commit federal wire fraud in real time, while the SEC watched every single keystroke. I was giving the federal government a front row seat to a corporate assassination, but the gun would be pointed squarely back at the assassins. Agent Carter sat back in his booth studying me with a mixture of awe and slight intimidation. He warned me that if anything went wrong, I could be implicated. He warned me that playing a double agent against a syndicate of ruthless financial criminals was incredibly dangerous. He told me I was risking my entire life on a very thin wire. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. I told him I was not in danger. I was the danger. I told him they had targeted my life. They had targeted my legacy. They had targeted my sanity. I wanted his freedom. I wanted his pride. I wanted his complete and total destruction. I would not accept anything less than watching them lose absolutely everything they valued. Marcus was a fool for underestimating me. He was a fool for stealing from me. He was a fool for thinking I would just roll over and die. Agent Carter pulled a pen from his suit pocket and nodded. The alliance was officially forged. We spent the next 2 hours finalizing the logistics of the sting operation. I provided him with the encrypted tracking codes I had embedded into Sarah's financial software. I gave him backdoor access to the Cayman Island routing numbers. I handed the federal government the exact coordinates of the blast zone. Every piece of data, every transaction, every late-night email between Marcus and his mistress would now be routed directly to federal servers. When I finally left the diner, the rain had stopped. I got back into my car and looked at the manila folder sitting on the passenger seat. The game was no longer just about surviving a treacherous marriage. I had just weaponized the federal government to act as my personal executioner. Marcus thought he was playing chess with a naive wife. He had no idea he was playing Russian roulette with the entire United States justice system. And I had personally loaded every single chamber. I started the engine and drove toward my office, a genuine smile finally resting on my face. The pieces were perfectly aligned and the countdown to their absolute ruin had officially begun. I drove directly from the diner to the towering glass skyscraper that housed Marcus's venture capital firm. The manila folder sat on my passenger seat containing the forged merger documents. I needed to hand these to him personally, but I also needed physical access to his devices to establish the absolute surveillance net Agent Carter and I had agreed upon. I strode through the polished marble lobby of his firm, projecting the confident aura of a high-powered executive wife. His assistant, a nervous young man named Tyler, smiled brightly and told me Marcus had just stepped into a brief partner huddle down the hall. He offered me coffee and opened the heavy glass door to Marcus's corner office, allowing me to wait inside. The moment the door clicked shut behind me, my demeanor shifted instantly from friendly spouse to a lethal operative. I had less than 5 minutes. I walked straight to his pristine mahogany desk and pulled a specialized flash drive from my purse. It was not a standard storage device. It was a custom-built hardware payload engineered by my own security team to bypass enterprise-level firewalls and inject a zero-day exploit directly into the operating system. I slid the drive into the hidden port on the back of his desktop monitor. The screen flickered for a fraction of a second as the malicious code bypassed his biometric locks and embedded itself deep within the root directory. But I could not stop there. I needed to compromise Sarah as well. I quickly opened his email client and found a recent thread between him and Sarah discussing the Cayman offshore accounts. I injected a microscopic tracking pixel into a seemingly innocuous financial spreadsheet and forwarded it to her email address using Marcus's account. The moment she opened that file on any of her devices, her entire digital life would be handed over to me. The progress bar on my customized drive crawled across the screen, mapping his hard drive syncing with his cloud accounts and activating the dormant microphones on his smartphone and tablet. It hit 70%. I heard loud footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor outside the office. It was Marcus laughing with one of his senior partners. 85%. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands remained perfectly steady. 90%. He was saying goodbye to his colleague right outside the frosted glass door. I watched the progress bar inch forward, agonizingly slow. 95%. The brass door handle began to turn. 100%. I yanked the flash drive from the port, slipped it silently into my pocket, and spun around just as the heavy door swung open. I immediately sank onto the plush leather sofa, crossing my legs, and casually flipping through a financial magazine I had grabbed from the coffee table. Marcus froze in the doorway, his eyes widening in genuine surprise. He quickly masked his shock with his signature charming smile. He walked over and pulled me up into a tight embrace, asking what I was doing there in the middle of the workday. I smiled up at him, tracing the lapel of his expensive suit. I pulled the manila folder from my bag and pressed it against his chest. I told him I had logged the documents with my legal team just like I promised and wanted to deliver the signed copies to him personally so he could expedite the filing. Relief washed over his face so palpably, it was almost comical. He kissed me deeply, calling me the perfect partner. He thought he had just secured the instrument of my destruction. He had no idea I had just turned his entire office, his phone and his life into a live broadcasting studio, feeding directly to federal agents and my own private servers. That night, the real surveillance began. I sat in the soundproof basement of my company headquarters, surrounded by a bank of glowing monitors. The tracking software had successfully infiltrated both Marcus and Sarah. I had unrestricted access to their text messages, their private calls, their geolocation data, and their encrypted messaging apps. I activated the remote microphone on Sarah's phone. I expected to hear her whispering sweet nothings to my husband or discussing their fraudulent stock strategies. Instead, I stumbled into a conversation that completely shattered my understanding of the Sterling family dynamic. Sarah was not talking to Marcus. She was talking to David, her husband, and Marcus's younger brother. Their voices filtered through my speakers crystal clear. They were not having a normal marital disagreement. They were having a vicious high-stakes confrontation. David sounded frantic, his voice trembling with sheer panic. He was begging Sarah to stop transferring funds from a specific escrow account. He sounded like a man drowning, pleading for a lifeline. Sarah's voice, in stark contrast, was absolute ice. She was not the supportive, sweet sister-in-law she pretended to be at family dinners. She sounded like a seasoned predator playing with her food. As I listened to the audio feed, the dark, twisted reality of their marriage unspooled right in front of me. David had not just been a passive observer in his family's shadow. 2 years ago, David had secretly embezzled over $2 million from a private client trust fund to cover massive gambling debts and a string of failed tech startups. He had desperately tried to hide the missing capital, but Sarah had found the discrepancies. Instead of turning him in or demanding a divorce, Sarah had methodically gathered every piece of evidence documenting his embezzlement. She had compiled the bank statements, the forged signatures, and the fake wire transfers into a secure digital vault. She did not confront him to save him. She confronted him to enslave him. She was actively blackmailing her own husband. The audio recording revealed the full extent of her extortion. Sarah was using the threat of federal prison to force David to facilitate the illegal transfers for the Meridian Apex offshore accounts. David was the compliance officer for a mid-sized wealth management firm, giving him the exact clearance needed to approve the shady routing numbers without raising red flags. He was a hostage trapped in a marriage built on financial terrorism. Sarah commanded him to authorize the latest batch of short sale funding derived from my stolen assets. And when David hesitated, she calmly reminded him that it would only take one anonymous email to the authorities to send him away for 20 years. I heard the sound of David quietly sobbing, followed by the sharp click of a door slamming as Sarah walked out on him. I sat back in my leather chair, staring at the audio waveforms on my monitor. The Sterling family was not just arrogant or greedy. They were a sophisticated syndicate of deeply corrupted individuals, bound together by blackmail lies and mutually assured destruction. Marcus was cheating on me with a woman who was actively terrorizing his own brother. And David, the quiet, unassuming brother, was facilitating my financial ruin just to save his own skin from his sociopathic wife. This discovery fundamentally shifted my entire strategy. Sarah thought she held all the cards because she possessed the evidence of David's crimes. She used that leverage to manipulate him into doing her dirty work, making him an accessory to the hostile takeover of my company. But now I possessed the evidence of her extortion. I possessed the evidence of David's embezzlement. I had a panoramic view of their entire rotten ecosystem. I did not just have the power to destroy Marcus and Sarah anymore. I had the power to detonate the entire family structure from the inside out. I began compiling this new evidence into a separate, highly classified folder. I meticulously logged the audio recordings mapping out the dates and times of Sarah's threats. I cross-referenced David's compliance authorizations with the incoming offshore transfers. I was no longer just building a defense for my own empire. I was assembling a weapon of mass destruction aimed squarely at the heart of their family legacy. They had all sat around my dining table smiling and toasting to my health while secretly orchestrating my demise. Now I held the match that would burn their lives to ash, and they were completely unaware that the countdown had already started. The morning after I uncovered the depths of David and Sarah's twisted marriage, I initiated the most critical defensive maneuver of my entire life. I did not go to my corporate headquarters, and I did not meet with the SEC. Instead, I took an untraceable private car to a highly discreet legal boutique in downtown Atlanta. Waiting for me in a soundproof conference room was Evelyn Thorne. Evelyn was not just a corporate attorney. She was a lethal apex predator in a tailored designer suit who specialized in protecting high-net-worth founders from hostile takeovers, corporate espionage, and predatory spouses. I had secretly retained her services the very minute I discovered Marcus's offshore accounts, and for the past week, she had been working around the clock to construct an impenetrable legal fortress. I sat across the polished glass table from Evelyn as she slid a thick stack of documents toward me. This was the masterstroke. It was the creation of an irrevocable blind trust. Marcus and Sarah had spent 14 months meticulously plotting to short the stock of my primary holding corporation. They were betting their stolen millions on the absolute certainty that when they leaked their fabricated embezzlement scandal, my company's valuation would plummet to zero and they would cash out the difference. They believed my company was a gold mine waiting to be plundered. They had no idea I was about to move all the gold out the back door. I picked up the heavy silver pen Evelyn offered me and began to sign the transfer protocols. With every stroke of my pen, I was executing a flawless corporate amputation. I legally stripped the primary holding corporation of its actual value. I transferred every single line of proprietary code, every groundbreaking patent, every highly classified algorithm, and all of the exclusive government contracts directly into the blind trust. The trust was entirely insulated, managed by a third-party fiduciary, who was legally bound to protect the assets from any corporate fallout or fabricated legal pressure. I sat in the quiet conference room and watched Evelyn stamp the official legal seals onto the documents. The sheer magnitude of what I had just accomplished settled over me like a heavy protective armor. My company still existed on paper. It still generated revenue. It still traded on the open market. To the outside world and to Marcus, it looked exactly like the multi-million-dollar tech empire he was preparing to steal. But structurally, it was now nothing more than a ghost ship. It was a hollow shell painted to look like a fortress. He wanted my algorithms. I gave him empty folders. He wanted my patents. I gave him expired drafts. He wanted my legacy. I gave him an illusion. He wanted my crown. I gave him a shadow. Evelyn looked at me over the rim of her glasses, confirming that the transfer was absolute and untraceable. Because I had structured my original corporate bylaws with extreme foresight years ago, this massive asset migration did not trigger a single financial alert on any of the systems Marcus monitored. He was completely blind to the fact that the vault he had spent over a year preparing to rob was now completely empty. By signing these documents, I had also technically relinquished direct control over the assets. This meant that even if Marcus used his forged documents or tried to force me into surrendering my company under the threat of a federal scandal, I literally did not have the legal authority to give it to him. He could hold a gun to my head, and it would not matter. The assets were locked in a vault that no longer responded to my fingerprints. The brilliance of this maneuver went far beyond simple protection. It actively weaponized Marcus's own greed against him. Short selling is an incredibly dangerous financial strategy because the potential losses are infinite. You borrow shares to sell them hoping the price drops. But if you borrow against an asset that suddenly implodes in a way you did not anticipate, the debt instantly becomes catastrophic. Marcus and Sarah were heavily leveraged, meaning they had borrowed massive amounts of capital on margin to maximize their payout. When the SEC finally dropped the hammer and froze the Meridian Apex offshore accounts, Marcus and Sarah would be trapped holding massive toxic debt tied to a company that no longer possessed any actual intellectual property. When they pulled the trigger on their corporate assassination, the bullet was going to ricochet directly into their own financial arteries. I thanked Evelyn, gathered my copies of the confirmation receipts, and walked out of the legal boutique. The Atlanta air felt crisp and clean in my lungs. For the past week, I had been carrying the suffocating weight of betrayal, playing a high-stakes game of deception in my own home. But as I got back into the private car, I felt genuinely untouchable. I had severed the oxygen line to their grand conspiracy. That evening I returned to our Buckhead estate and found Marcus sitting in the living room pouring us each a glass of expensive bourbon. He looked so incredibly relaxed, so smugly confident in his impending victory. He handed me a crystal glass and kissed my cheek, asking how my day at the office had been. I looked into his eyes and smiled the brightest, most authentic smile I had given him in weeks. I told him my day was incredibly productive and that I had finally secured the future of my company. He laughed and pulled me against his chest, agreeing that our future was going to be brighter than ever. He looked at me like I was a prize he was just days away from claiming. He had absolutely no idea he was standing in the middle of a burning building holding a match he lit himself. The weekend arrived, bringing a suffocating southern heat wave that mirrored the rising tension inside my own home. I had secured my assets in the blind trust, but protecting myself was only half the battle. Now I needed to actively arm the bomb that would obliterate Marcus and Sarah. To execute their final financial maneuver, they needed one last crucial piece of the puzzle. They needed my authenticated master digital signature. Marcus had the physical merger documents, but for the massive offshore credit lines they planned to open in my name, they required the cryptographic key that authorized my highest-level corporate transactions. Sarah was the architect of their financial plumbing, and despite her role as an independent financial advisor, she fancied herself a capable hacker. I knew exactly how her mind worked. She was arrogant enough to believe she could breach my personal devices if I simply gave her the right opportunity. I decided to serve her the opportunity on a silver platter. On Saturday morning, I brought my secondary work laptop into our home office. I deliberately bypassed my highly encrypted corporate virtual private network and connected the device directly to our standard residential internet router. I spent an hour writing a customized script that intentionally downgraded the firewall protocols on this specific machine. I carefully unraveled the layers of security, leaving a seemingly invisible but wide-open back door that led directly into a quarantined sector of the hard drive. Inside that isolated sector, I placed the bait. It was a digital folder explicitly labeled Master Security Credentials. Inside that folder rested a highly convincing duplicate of my digital signature key. But it was fundamentally altered. I had encoded the signature with a microscopic malicious payload. When used on any financial document, it would look entirely authentic to a banking institution. However, the moment the signature was executed, it would instantly ping a hidden server permanently logging the IP address, the MAC address, and the precise physical geolocation of the device deploying it. It was a cryptographic tracking beacon disguised as a golden ticket. I poured myself a glass of iced lemon water and sat in the quiet shadow of my office watching my primary surveillance monitor. Marcus was supposedly at the country club playing 18 holes with his venture capital partners. Through the spyware I had installed on Sarah's phone, I knew she was sitting alone in her luxurious suburban living room just 10 miles away. I pulled up my hidden network tracing program, and I waited. I did not have to wait long. Sarah was meticulous, but she was also incredibly greedy, and greed breeds a very specific kind of impatience. She knew Marcus was out of the house, and she assumed I would be lounging by the pool or out shopping. It took her exactly 42 minutes to find the vulnerability I had broadcasted. My tracking monitor blinked a sharp, vibrant red. An unauthorized external IP address was attempting to handshake with my compromised secondary laptop. I leaned forward, resting my chin on my folded hands, watching the lines of green code scroll rapidly across my black screen. Sarah was deploying a standard brute force entry protocol. It was a clumsy elementary hacking technique that my actual corporate defenses would have neutralized in a microsecond. But I had disabled the alarms. I watched her digital avatar stumble through the fake security barriers I had left for her. She was breaking down doors that I had intentionally left unlocked. She truly thought she was executing a masterful cyber heist. She believed she was outsmarting the founder and chief executive officer of a top-tier technology security firm. I sat perfectly still, sipping my iced water, watching a thief break into a vault that was specifically designed to lock her inside forever. She wanted my authorization. I gave her an anchor. She wanted my identity. I gave her a tracking device. She wanted my signature. I gave her a confession. She wanted to win. I gave her a prison sentence. I watched the progress bar on my monitor mirror the exact actions she was taking on her end. She navigated through the dummy directories, bypassing files I had labeled with enticing financial titles, until she found the quarantined sector. She located the target folder. She initiated the download. The data package was relatively small, taking only 14 seconds to transfer across the network. I counted every single second out loud in the quiet of my office. 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. The moment the download reached 100%, the trap snapped completely shut. The hidden payload embedded itself deep into her personal computer's registry. I now possessed a permanent, unbreakable link between my forged digital signature and Sarah's exact physical machine. There was absolutely no way she could ever deny pulling the trigger. The digital forensics would lead federal investigators straight to her living room couch. I closed the tracing program and powered down the secondary laptop. A deep, profound satisfaction settled into my bones. The bait had been taken and swallowed whole. They now possessed everything they needed to finalize their fraudulent corporate loans and initiate the massive short squeeze against my company stock. They were entirely ready to launch their grand offensive. They were ready to steal my life. They had absolutely no idea that the weapon they were holding was a dummy grenade, and the trigger was wired directly to the floorboards beneath their own feet. I stood up from my desk, walked to the window, and looked out at the bright Atlanta sun. The board was set. The pieces were locked. The final act was approaching with the speed of a runaway train, and I was the only one who knew the bridge was out. That evening, Marcus returned home with a bounce in his step that bordered on euphoric. He poured us both a generous glass of expensive bourbon, celebrating what he claimed was a massive breakthrough at his venture capital firm. He spun a beautiful lie about securing a revolutionary funding round for a new client. He celebrated his victory. He celebrated his wealth. He celebrated his genius. He celebrated his fraud. He did not know that the only thing he was actually celebrating was his rapid descent into permanent financial ruin. Through the surveillance feed I monitored later that night, I watched the digital execution of their ultimate betrayal. Sarah had wasted no time. With the stolen digital signature safely in her possession, she initiated a secure video conference with Marcus. Their faces illuminated my basement monitors, glowing with pure, unadulterated greed. Sarah shared her screen, walking Marcus through the labyrinth of international loan applications she had prepared. They were applying for $15 million in highly leveraged corporate credit lines, drawing from aggressive offshore lenders who did not ask questions but demanded absolute collateral. They were using my name, my company, and my pristine credit rating to secure the massive capital they needed to fund their short sale attack against my stock. I watched Sarah's cursor hover over the final authorization box. She uploaded the master digital signature she had stolen from my dummy folder earlier that day. Marcus leaned closer to his camera, his eyes wide with anticipation. He told her to execute the protocol. He told her to seal the deal. He told her to take everything. Sarah clicked the button. The approval screens flashed green across their monitors. $15 million in liquid capital was instantly approved and routed directly into their Meridian Apex holding accounts. Marcus let out a triumphant shout, pumping his fist in the air. Sarah smiled a predatory grin, congratulating him on becoming a very wealthy man. They believed they had just pulled off the financial heist of the decade. They believed they were invincible. They believed they had crushed me. They were entirely oblivious to the silent digital execution happening in the background. The moment Sarah applied that stolen signature to the PDF contracts, the malicious payload I had engineered sprang to life. It was a masterpiece of reverse encryption. Financial documents of that magnitude rely on dynamic data fields, specifically tying the signature to an embedded employer identification number and a personal social security number. When the bank servers authenticated the signature, my code intercepted the digital handshake. It performed a microscopic, seamless surgical swap deep within the metadata. It scrubbed my personal tax identification number from the files. It erased my corporate liability codes. It completely removed my identity from the chain of debt. In my place, the code dynamically injected the tax identification numbers I had scraped from Marcus and Sarah's personal files. It pulled Marcus's social security number. It pulled Sarah's independent contractor tax codes. It hardwired their actual identities directly into the metadata of the $15 million loan agreements. They thought they were binding me to the debt. They bound themselves. They thought they were chaining me to a sinking ship. They chained themselves. They thought they were securing a lavish future. They secured their own financial execution. Because offshore lenders of this caliber use automated instantaneous clearinghouse protocols, the contracts were immediately and legally binding. The banks did not care about the name typed in a standard font on the top of the page. They only looked at the encrypted tax metadata embedded in the verified signature file. And that metadata now unequivocally pointed to Marcus Sterling and Sarah Sterling. The $15 million sitting in their Cayman Islands account was no longer stolen corporate leverage. It was a massive, inescapable personal debt. And because they were using that capital to short sell a company that no longer held any valuable assets, their investment was mathematically guaranteed to implode. The moment the market realized my company was a hollow shell, the stock would become completely worthless, but their short positions would be called in. The offshore lenders would demand immediate repayment of the $15 million, plus astronomical interest. And when those ruthless international bankers came looking to collect their money, they would not be looking for me. They would be looking directly at Marcus and Sarah. I sat in the glow of my monitors watching them celebrate their impending doom. They were drinking champagne and discussing travel itineraries to Europe. They were planning a future built on a foundation of absolute vapor. The $15 million liability was now a ticking time bomb strapped tightly to their chests. Every time they spent $1 of that money, they were digging their own graves deeper and deeper into the bedrock of federal wire fraud and international debt default. They stole my trust. They stole my time. They stole my peace. But they would not steal my money. They would only steal their own absolute ruin. I closed the surveillance application and leaned back in my leather chair. The digital trap was fully operational, and the reverse encryption had executed flawlessly. There was no way for them to undo the contracts. There was no way for them to swap the tax identification numbers back. The ink was dry and the digital ledger was permanently sealed. I had successfully insulated my entire empire and redirected a catastrophic financial strike right back at the people who launched it. The preparation phase was officially over. All that remained was the final performance. It was time to put on a beautiful dress, attend a glamorous family party, and light the match that would burn their fraudulent lives to the ground. The countdown to the anniversary gala began. I had exactly 2 weeks to play the role of my life. If Marcus and Sarah were going to walk blindly into the execution chamber, they needed to believe they were the ones leading me there. They needed to feel absolute, undeniable power. So I gave it to them. I became the perfect, fragile victim. I started coming home from the corporate office looking completely drained. I would drop my briefcase by the door, kick off my heels, and collapse onto the living room sofa, rubbing my temples as if the weight of my empire was crushing my skull. I complained about the board of directors. I complained about market volatility. I complained about sleepless nights and overwhelming stress. I told Marcus I was burning out. I told him I felt like everything I had built was slipping through my fingers. I told him I just wanted to hide from the world. He played his part flawlessly. He rubbed my shoulders. He poured my tea. He whispered that I needed to rest and let him carry the burden for a while. He smiled his supportive husband smile. He kissed my forehead with his supportive husband lips. He spoke his supportive husband lies. But behind his warm brown eyes I could see the predatory gleam. He was absolutely ecstatic. He thought my exhaustion was the result of his brilliant corporate sabotage. He thought the stress of the impending stock crash was already bleeding into my subconscious. He thought he was breaking me down piece by piece. I let him think it. I let him take control of our social calendar. I let him handle the RSVPs for his parents' upcoming 40th anniversary gala. I let him manage the contractors and the household staff. I surrendered every ounce of domestic and personal authority directly into his eager hands. Every time I handed him a task, his ego inflated just a little bit more. He felt powerful. He felt invincible. He felt like an undisputed king preparing to inherit an empire. Through my surveillance network, I listened to his conversations with Sarah. Their arrogance had mutated into pure delusion. They mocked my sudden fragility. They laughed at how easily I was crumbling under the pressure of a crisis I did not even know was happening yet. Sarah called me a weak-minded workaholic who lacked the stomach for real corporate warfare. Marcus agreed, calling me a fragile genius who needed to be put out to pasture. They congratulated each other on their brilliance. They congratulated each other on their wealth. They congratulated each other on my impending destruction. I listened to their mockery with a heart made of absolute ice. They thought they were the predators circling a wounded animal. They did not know the wounded animal was actually a steel trap waiting for them to step inside. They thought they were draining my strength. They did not know they were just fueling my vengeance. They thought they were winning the war. They did not know the war was already over and they had already lost. 3 days before the anniversary gala, Marcus brought me another stack of financial authorizations. These were the final approvals needed to route our personal assets into his designated accounts, supposedly to protect me from the upcoming corporate audits. I was sitting at the kitchen island nursing a cup of chamomile tea, looking pale and defeated. He placed the pen in my hand, his touch lingering, his voice dripping with fake concern. I looked up at him, my eyes wide and tired. I told him I did not even want to read the documents anymore. I told him legal jargon gave me a headache. I told him I trusted him completely and that I did not know how I would survive without his protection. I signed the documents without glancing at a single page. The surge of triumph that rolled off him was so intense it was practically visible. He took the documents back, his hands trembling slightly with adrenaline. He looked at me not with love or partnership, but with the triumphant sneer of a conqueror looking at his conquered territory. He had done it. He had convinced the brilliant tech CEO to hand over the keys to her castle without a single fight. He thought he was the smartest man in the world. He thought he had committed the perfect crime. He was so blinded by his own vanity that he never bothered to verify if the keys I handed him actually unlocked anything. He never checked the metadata. He never realized that the documents I just signed were completely meaningless, tethered to a blind trust that rendered them entirely void. He was holding a stack of expensive, worthless paper. As he walked out of the kitchen whistling a cheerful tune, I took a slow sip of my tea. My posture straightened. The exhaustion melted from my face, instantly replaced by cold, sharp calculation. The fragile wife performance was exhausted, but the executioner was wide awake. The trap was fully primed. The countdown was in its final hours. Marcus and Sarah were walking into the grandest party of the year, expecting to celebrate their victory and their newfound stolen millions. They were expecting to toast to my ruin. Instead, I was going to serve them a public execution, wrapped in a diamond necklace and an emerald gown. I rinsed my teacup in the sink, dried my hands, and walked upstairs to my closet. It was time to pull out the red dress. The bloodbath was about to begin. The St. Regis Ballroom was a blinding display of wealth and legacy. Valet attendants rushed to open the doors of imported luxury vehicles, while photographers captured the arrival of Atlanta's most influential black elite. I stepped out of our chauffeured car, and the flashbulbs immediately reflected off the heavy silk of my vibrant red dress. It was a custom gown, tailored to fit me like a second skin, plunging sharply at the neckline and flowing into a dramatic sweeping train. I had spent the last 2 weeks playing the role of a wilted, shrinking flower, but tonight I was a wildfire. I paired the dress with the diamond necklace Marcus had given me for my birthday, letting his fraudulent gift rest coldly against my collarbone. When Marcus stepped out of the car and offered me his arm, I saw a brief flicker of confusion cross his face. The fragile, exhausted woman he had left at home was completely gone. In her place stood a queen walking onto a battlefield to reclaim her stolen throne. He tried to mask his unease with his signature charismatic smile, but his grip on my waist was slightly too tight. He whispered that I looked incredible, but his voice lacked its usual arrogant ease. He could feel the shift in my frequency. He just could not identify the source. I smiled back at him, a sharp, brilliant expression that did not reach my eyes. I told him tonight was going to be a night we would remember for the rest of our lives. He chuckled, assuming I meant the celebration of his parents' 40-year marriage. We walked past the velvet ropes and stepped onto the red carpet, moving through the grand entrance of the ballroom. The scent of rare orchids and expensive cologne filled the air, mixing with the sound of a live jazz band playing softly on a raised mahogany stage. Every head turned as we entered the room. We were the golden couple, the perfect intersection of venture capital and technology wealth. Senators, corporate titans, and real estate moguls raised their crystal glasses in our direction. I glided through the crowd with absolute precision, greeting our acquaintances with warm hugs and flawless pleasantries. I let Marcus do the heavy lifting in the conversations, watching him preen and boast about his latest acquisitions. He was entirely in his element, surrounded by power and money, soaking up the admiration of his peers. I let him enjoy the spotlight. I let him feel like the king of the world, because the higher he climbed, the more devastating the impact of his fall would be. Across the sea of tailored tuxedos and glittering evening gowns, I spotted our primary targets. David and Sarah were standing near a towering ice sculpture, holding court with a group of investment bankers. Sarah was wearing a sleek silver dress that clung to her frame, holding a glass of vintage champagne with a practiced elegance. She looked incredibly smug, radiating the dark, arrogant energy of a woman who believed she had just pulled off the perfect heist. Beside her, David looked slightly pale, his smile forced and his eyes darting nervously around the room. He was the weak link, the hostage to Sarah's blackmail, carrying the heavy burden of his own embezzlement and his complicity in my attempted ruin. As we approached them, Sarah's eyes locked onto my red dress. For a microsecond, her confident facade slipped, revealing a flash of sheer intimidation. She had expected the broken, exhausted woman Marcus had been describing to her in their secret messages. She had expected an easy victim. Instead, she was staring at an executioner. She quickly recovered, pasting on a bright, artificial smile and stepping forward to pull me into a fake embrace. She told me I looked absolutely stunning and asked how I was holding up under all my corporate stress. Her tone was laced with mock sympathy, a subtle dig intended to assert her imagined dominance. I stepped back from her embrace and met her gaze with total unyielding calm. I told her I had never felt better. I told her the stress was completely gone because I had finally eliminated all the toxic liabilities from my portfolio. I kept my voice light and conversational, but I held eye contact just a second too long, letting the weight of my words press heavily against her chest. I saw her swallow hard, her silver dress suddenly looking a little less glamorous against my crimson silk. Marcus, oblivious to the silent war being waged right beside him, clapped David on the shoulder and suggested they go greet the mayor who had just arrived. I watched my husband walk away, leaving me alone with the woman who was sleeping with him and actively plotting to send me to federal prison. The live band transitioned into a slow, elegant melody. The ballroom swirled with laughter and the clinking of expensive crystal. The Sterling family had spared no expense to celebrate their legacy of success and unity. They had gathered the most important people in their social and professional circles to witness their triumph. It was the perfect stage. It was the perfect audience. I looked around the room, mapping the exits, identifying the key stakeholders, and calculating the exact blast radius of the truth I was about to detonate. I was no longer the naive wife trying to hold a marriage together. I was no longer the stressed executive trying to protect her company. I was a force of absolute reckoning, wearing a red dress that signaled the incoming slaughter. I took a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and took a slow, deliberate sip. The trap was locked. The audience was seated. The cameras were ready. I looked back at Sarah, offering her one final polite smile before turning my back on her and walking toward the main stage. The grand performance was about to reach its climax, and I was the only one holding the microphone. The jazz band concluded their set with a vibrant flourish, and the ambient chatter in the grand ballroom slowly faded into an expectant hush. The event coordinator stepped up to the microphone, announcing that it was time for the evening's primary toasts. Marcus ascended the mahogany stairs to the main stage, looking every inch the devoted son and the powerful corporate leader. He adjusted his tailored tuxedo jacket, his movements fluid and practiced. He tapped the microphone once, ensuring he had the absolute attention of every senator, venture capitalist, and socialite in the room. The screech of feedback quickly died down, replaced by his booming, charismatic voice, projecting across the sea of crystal glasses and expensive floral arrangements. He began his speech by honoring his parents and their 40 years of marriage. He spoke passionately about the unbreakable foundation of trust, the unwavering loyalty of family, and how their legacy of absolute honesty had shaped him into the man he was today. Every syllable he uttered was a masterclass in hypocrisy. I stood near the front row, maintaining my perfect posture, letting his toxic words wash over me. I looked at his parents seated at the VIP table, beaming with overwhelming pride, completely unaware that their golden son was a ruthless corporate predator actively plotting to destroy his own wife. Then Marcus shifted his focus, and the spotlight followed his gaze directly to me. His voice dropped an octave, taking on a tone of profound manufactured reverence. He pointed at me, illuminating the vibrant crimson silk of my dress for the entire room to see. He told the crowd that witnessing his parents' enduring love reminded him daily of his own incredible marriage. He spoke about my technology empire, but he framed it with calculated malice. He talked about how exhausting the industry had been for me, how much of my sanity I had sacrificed for success, and how he had recently needed to step up to carry my heavy burdens. He painted a masterful picture of a brilliant but rapidly crumbling woman who desperately needed her strong, capable husband to save her from her own overwhelming ambition. He was setting the narrative for my imminent downfall right in front of my face. He was conditioning this room full of highly influential people to believe I was on the verge of a total mental breakdown, so that when he stole my company, they would view it as an act of mercy. He lied about his humility. He lied about his admiration. He lied about his loyalty. He lied about his protection. He lied about everything. I watched the crowd react to his performance. I saw the sympathetic nods from the wives of the board members. I saw the approving glances from the real estate moguls. I looked toward the back of the room and saw Sarah standing near the ice sculpture, raising her champagne glass in a silent, mocking salute to Marcus and his brilliant theatrical performance. They were eating right out of his hand. They truly believed they were witnessing the ultimate display of Black excellence and marital devotion. Marcus finished his speech by asking the ballroom for a massive round of applause for the strongest, most resilient woman he knew. The room erupted into thunderous clapping and cheering. He extended his hand toward me, smiling warmly, inviting me up to the stage to share a few words. This was the moment. The exact second the pendulum of power swung violently in my direction. I ascended the stairs slowly, deliberately, letting the heavy silk of my red train glide softly across the polished wood. I did not look like a fragile woman on the verge of a breakdown. I looked like a predator stepping directly into the light. Marcus met me halfway across the stage. He wrapped his arm tightly around my waist, pulling me close so the event photographers could capture the perfect picture. He leaned down, his lips brushing against my ear, and whispered that I was doing great, and to just keep my remarks brief so we could get back to the party. I smiled up at him. It was a genuine, terrifying smile that was so utterly devoid of warmth it finally made his confident expression falter. I felt his grip on my waist loosen in sudden confusion. He tried to pull away to assess my face, but I stepped smoothly past him, moving directly to the center podium. I took the microphone from the stand. The ballroom fell completely silent, hundreds of eyes fixed entirely on me. I did not look back at Marcus. I looked out over the sea of expectant faces, letting the heavy silence stretch just long enough to make the room feel deeply uncomfortable. I began my speech, my voice steady and echoing clearly off the high vaulted ceilings. I told the guests that Marcus had just spoken beautifully about honesty and partnership. I told them that 40 years of marriage was indeed built on a foundation of absolute, unwavering transparency. I swept my gaze across the crowd, locking eyes briefly with Sarah in the back of the room. I told them that tonight, in honor of the Sterling family legacy, I wanted to share the purest, most unfiltered truth about what actually goes on behind closed doors. I stated that true partnership requires stripping away all the beautiful illusions and facing reality head-on. I reached into the small clutch purse hidden in the folds of my gown. I did not pull out a speech written on cue cards. I pulled out my smartphone. I stepped away from the center of the podium and walked 2 steps to the right where the audio technician had set up the central sound mixing console for the event. The technician looked up at me completely confused by my deviation from the planned program, but I flashed him a look of absolute unyielding authority that froze him in his seat. I picked up the auxiliary input cable resting on his soundboard. I spoke directly into the microphone one last time, telling the audience that words can be incredibly deceiving, but actions and evidence never lie. I announced that I had brought a special audio tribute that captured the exact essence of Marcus and his devotion to our marriage. I told them it was a recording that truly defined the integrity of the Sterling family. I plugged the heavy auxiliary cable directly into my phone. I looked back up at the stage. Marcus had taken a step forward, his brow furrowed in deep alarm, finally realizing that this was not the script we had agreed upon. His hands twitched at his sides. In the back of the room, Sarah was no longer smiling. Her posture had gone entirely rigid, her champagne glass lowered to her side. David was looking back and forth between his brother on stage and his wife in the crowd, sensing the sudden, suffocating shift in the atmosphere. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, waiting in absolute silence for the heartwarming tribute I had just promised. The room was perfectly still, completely ripe for absolute destruction. I looked directly into Marcus's eyes, offering him one last razor-sharp smile, letting him see the executioner hiding beneath the red silk. My finger hovered over the screen of my phone, resting directly on the play button. I did not hesitate. I pressed play. The state-of-the-art surround sound system of the St. Regis Ballroom was designed for symphony orchestras and premium entertainment. When the audio file began to play, the crisp, digital clarity of the recording echoed off the vaulted ceilings and bounced against the crystal chandeliers with terrifying perfection. There was no static. There was no muffled background noise. There was only the undeniable baritone of my husband laughing. "She is completely clueless." Marcus's recorded voice boomed across the grand hall. The exact same voice that had just delivered a passionate monologue about family values and marital devotion was now dripping with absolute contempt. "She is so busy staring at her security codes, she does not even realize I have already drained the joint investment accounts. She actually believes I am working late tonight." A collective gasp rippled through the hundreds of elite guests. The clinking of silverware halted instantly. The waiters carrying trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres froze mid-step, but the recording was only just beginning. A second voice joined the audio track, melodious and laced with a toxic, predatory arrogance. It was Sarah. "She is nothing but a stepping stone, Marcus. We just need her to sign the merger documents, and the Cayman accounts will be fully funded. Meridian Apex is ready to receive the capital. By the time she realizes the company is bleeding out, we will be drinking vintage wine in Paris." The silence in the ballroom became so dense it felt like a physical weight pressing down on everyone's chests. I stood perfectly still by the audio mixing console, watching the shockwave detonate in real time. My eyes locked onto Marcus up on the main stage. The flawless, confident mask he had worn for 36 years melted off his face in less than 10 seconds. His rich mahogany complexion turned a sickly ashen gray. His jaw went slack, and his eyes darted wildly around the room as the sheer magnitude of his public exposure paralyzed him. He took a hesitant, stumbling step toward the edge of the stage, but his legs refused to carry him further. He was trapped in the blinding spotlight, listening to his own treachery being broadcast to every influential senator, venture capitalist, and socialite in Atlanta. Then the audio shifted. The conversation about financial fraud seamlessly transitioned into the undeniable, intimate sounds of their physical affair. The heavy breathing, the rustling of expensive hotel sheets, Marcus whispering dark, graphic promises to his brother's wife, telling Sarah how much he desired her, how my presence was nothing more than a tedious business transaction he had to endure until they secured the payout. The sheer explicit nature of the betrayal, amplified to concert-level volume, was devastating. I watched the camera lens of reality zoom in on Sarah standing near the towering ice sculpture at the back of the room. The confident smirk she had worn all evening was completely eradicated. Her hands began to tremble so violently that the vintage champagne spilled over the rim of her crystal glass, splashing dark stains across her sleek silver dress. The wealthy socialites and investment bankers who had been laughing with her just moments before physically recoiled. They stepped away from her in unison, creating a wide, visible circle of isolation around her. She looked frantically around the room, her eyes wide with the raw, visceral terror of a woman realizing her reputation, her marriage, and her freedom were evaporating in front of her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She was drowning in the echoes of her own sins. But the most tragic casualty of the crossfire was David. I watched his gaze snap from the stage where his brother stood paralyzed to the back of the room where his wife stood trembling. The audio specifically mentioned him. Sarah's recorded voice cut through the heavy breathing, laughing cruelly about her husband. David is weak. He will do exactly what I tell him to do, because he is too terrified I will expose his little embezzlement problem. He is just a pathetic pawn, Marcus. He is nothing compared to you. David dropped his drink. The heavy crystal glass hit the polished hardwood floor and shattered into 100 jagged pieces, but nobody even flinched at the sound because the audio was so magnetic and so horrifying. The look on David's face was one of absolute, total annihilation. His eyes hollowed out, becoming completely dead. He was standing in a room surrounded by hundreds of people, but he had never been more alone. His brother, the man he idolized, was stealing from his family. His wife, the woman he feared and loved, was sleeping with his brother and using his own crimes to blackmail him into submission. His entire reality collapsed, crushing him under the weight of a double betrayal so profound it defied human comprehension. The recording pushed toward its grand finale. The voices of Marcus and Sarah explicitly laid out the final phase of their corporate assassination. They bragged about the forged merger documents. They detailed the hostile takeover. They gleefully discussed their plan to trigger a federal investigation that would send me to prison for tax fraud, leaving them free to liquidate my patents and abscond with $15 million in stolen assets. I watched the kingdom burn. I watched the golden boy stripped of his armor. I watched the fake sister-in-law crumble into dust. The guests in the ballroom were no longer just shocked. They were horrified. Several board members from Marcus's venture capital fund aggressively pulled out their phones, likely drafting emergency emails to their public relations and legal departments to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. The reputation of the Sterling family, a legacy built over 4 decades, was disintegrating into absolute nothingness in less than 3 minutes of audio. I stood by the console entirely unbothered. I did not shed a tear. I did not scream. I did not break down. I watched them writhe in the very trap they had spent 14 months building for me. They had tried to push me into the dark, but they forgot that I was the one who controlled the light. The audio track finally clicked to an end, leaving a ringing, deafening silence in the grand ballroom. The echo of their guilt hung heavy in the air, choking the oxygen from the room. I reached out and calmly unplugged my phone from the auxiliary cable. I slowly turned my attention back to the stage where Marcus was standing, his chest heaving, his mind desperately scrambling to find a way out of a maze that had no exits. Marcus broke out of his temporary paralysis with a violent, sudden jolt. He scrambled down the mahogany stairs of the main stage, his expensive leather shoes slipping dangerously on the polished wood. He knocked the heavy metal microphone stand to the floor with a deafening crash and lunged toward the audio mixing console where I was standing perfectly still. His eyes were wide, wild, and erratic, radiating the frantic, unstable energy of a predator, suddenly realizing it was trapped in a cage. He reached out aggressively, trying to snatch my phone, trying to rip the evidence right out of my hands, but I smoothly stepped back entirely out of his reach. I simply slipped the device back into my red silk clutch and folded my arms across my chest. I watched him scramble. I watched him panic. I watched the powerful, influential venture capitalist devolve into a desperate, scrambling liar right in front of the Atlanta elite. He bent down and snatched the fallen microphone from the floor. The audio feedback whined sharply, causing several distinguished guests to cover their ears and step further away from the stage. Marcus gripped the microphone with both hands, his knuckles turning stark white as he turned to face the horrified ballroom. "This is a complete fabrication," he shouted into the microphone. His voice was trembling, cracking under the immense, suffocating pressure of a room filled with staring, judgmental eyes. "Listen to me, everyone, please. You have to listen to me. This is a deepfake. It is an artificial intelligence-generated audio file created by our corporate rivals. They are trying to sabotage my upcoming merger. They used voice cloning software to frame Sarah and me. It is a hostile cyber attack on my family and my firm." He looked around the room, his chest heaving frantically, locking eyes with the senior partners of his venture capital fund. "You all know the technology out there today," he pleaded, his tone shifting from authoritative to pathetically desperate. "You know how easily audio can be manipulated and synthesized. I love my wife. I love my family. I would never betray my own brother. This is a targeted, malicious attack against the Sterling legacy. Please do not let these criminals win by believing this fabricated garbage." He was sweating profusely now. The expensive designer cologne he wore mingled heavily with the sharp, undeniable scent of raw fear. He pointed a trembling finger at the sound system, playing the victim, playing the righteous defender of the family honor. He lied about the audio. He lied about the technology. He lied about the corporate espionage. He lied about his absolute innocence. He was standing in the smoking wreckage of his own design, desperately trying to convince everyone that the fire was just an optical illusion. I did not interrupt him. I did not raise my voice to shout that he was a liar. I let him dig the hole deeper and deeper. The crowd was not buying a single word. The venture capitalists he was begging for validation were already turning their backs, putting on their coats and whispering frantically to their crisis management teams. The silence from his professional peers was absolute, and it was utterly deafening. They recognized the unmistakable cadence of his arrogance in that recording. They knew it was undeniably real, and Marcus realized they knew. The true explosion, however, did not happen on the stage. It happened near the towering ice sculpture at the back of the room. The sharp sound of crunching glass echoed loudly as David took a slow, deliberate step forward, crushing the remains of his dropped crystal glass under his dress shoes. He did not look at the whispers in the crowd. He did not look at me. His hollow, dead eyes were fixed entirely on his wife. Sarah was backing away from him, her sleek silver dress trembling as her carefully constructed reality completely disintegrated. "David," she pleaded, her voice, a high-pitched, desperate whisper carrying across the quiet room. "David, you have to believe Marcus. It is a fake. Someone is trying to ruin us. You know I would never do that to you." David stopped just inches away from her. For his entire life, David had been the submissive younger brother, the quiet man who took orders and kept his head down to avoid conflict. But the man standing before Sarah now was completely stripped of his fear. "You called me a pathetic pawn, Sarah," David said, his voice eerily calm, carrying a lethal, devastating weight. "You laughed about blackmailing me. You laughed about sleeping with my own brother in his marital bed while you held my mistakes over my head like a guillotine." Sarah's face flushed a deep, guilty red. She glanced nervously at the surrounding guests, realizing that her psychological leverage over David was entirely useless now that everything was exposed to the public. "David, please," she hissed, dropping the innocent victim act and leaning in close to him, her tone turning vicious. "If you do not back me up right now, I will release the files. I will send the embezzlement proof to the federal authorities tonight. I will send you to prison, David. Do not test me." David let out a dry, hollow laugh that sent absolute chills through the grand ballroom. "Send them," he replied loudly, ensuring every single person in the room could hear him. "Send the files, Sarah. Send me to federal prison. I would rather sit in a concrete cell for the next 20 years than spend one more single minute sleeping next to a sociopath who is actively tearing my family apart. Sarah physically recoiled as if he had struck her across the face. She had relied entirely on his cowardice to keep him compliant. She had weaponized his fear of imprisonment to turn him into her personal financial puppet. But she had severely underestimated what happens when a man loses absolutely everything he has left to lose. David was no longer afraid of her threats, because his entire world had just been burned to the ground. He had no reputation left to protect, and he had no marriage left to save. Marcus, seeing his brother snapping and the narrative completely falling apart, threw the microphone down and rushed through the crowd toward them. "David, calm down," Marcus shouted, grabbing his brother's shoulder with a heavy, forceful hand. "Do not let this fake audio tear us apart. We are brothers. We are the Sterlings. We have to stand together against this outside attack." David slowly turned his head to look at the hand resting on his shoulder. He looked at his older brother, the golden boy, the man who had secretly plotted to steal his wife and strip away his dignity. The transition from a passive broken brother to a man running on pure agonizing rage was instantaneous. David lunged forward and shoved Marcus backward with such explosive, violent force that Marcus crashed directly into a highly decorated catered dessert table. A massive multi-tiered anniversary cake and dozens of heavy crystal platters came crashing down to the floor in a spectacular mess of shattered glass and ruined frosting. "Do not touch me!" David roared, his voice tearing through the elegant ballroom like a jagged blade. "Do not ever put your hands on me again. You are not my brother. You are a parasite. You slept with my wife. You plotted to steal from Imani. You tried to destroy the woman who built you up, and you used my entire life as your acceptable collateral damage." Marcus scrambled to his feet, wiping white cake frosting and shattered glass from his tailored tuxedo jacket. He tried to speak to regain his authoritative posture to demand respect, but the damage was entirely irreversible. At the VIP table in the center of the room, his mother let out a loud, wailing sob, burying her face in her hands, as the pristine legacy of the Sterling family was violently slaughtered in front of the Atlanta elite. His father sat completely paralyzed, staring blankly at his two grown sons, fighting like wild animals in the middle of a five-star restaurant. The perfect image of black excellence they had cultivated for 40 years was lying dead in a pile of ruined cake and shattered crystal. I stood on the periphery of the chaos in my vibrant red dress, watching the beautiful, absolute carnage unfold exactly as I had designed it. The venom they had kept hidden deep in their veins had finally breached the surface, and they were tearing each other apart without me having to lift a single finger. I had simply held up a high-definition mirror to their dark deception and allowed them to destroy their own kingdom. But my execution protocol was not completely finished. Marcus was still trying to salvage his corporate standing. He was still holding on to the desperate, pathetic hope that he could manage the public relations fallout with his venture capital partners. He was still operating under the massive delusion that he possessed $15 million in offshore capital that would cushion this devastating social fall. It was time to strip away the final layer of his false reality. It was time to expose him to the catastrophic financial nightmare he had blindly signed his name to and seal his fate forever. I picked up the sleek black leather portfolio I had hidden behind the audio console before the speeches began. The heavy weighted paper inside felt like the ultimate instrument of justice. I walked slowly toward the center of the room, the heels of my shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, cutting through the lingering murmurs of the stunned crowd. Marcus was desperately trying to smooth his ruined tuxedo jacket, trying to corner one of his senior managing partners to salvage his career. He was whispering frantically about liquidity and offshore reserves, thinking his stolen millions would act as a golden parachute. He was still operating under the delusion that wealth could shield him from the social slaughter he was currently enduring. I stopped right next to the shattered dessert table. I looked directly at the senior partners of his venture capital firm. They were men who worshipped money and abhorred public scandal. I unzipped the leather portfolio and pulled out a thick stack of high-gloss paper. I tossed the first packet directly onto the VIP table, right in front of Marcus's boss. Then I tossed another onto the table next to it, and another, until copies of the contracts were scattered across the white linen tablecloths of the Atlanta elite. Marcus stopped his frantic whispering. He looked down at the documents, his eyes scanning the bold red lettering of the Meridian Apex Holdings logo. He let out a breathless, arrogant scoff. He actually thought I was showing the room the merger documents he believed I had signed. He tried to spin it. He pointed at the papers and told the room I was completely hysterical, violating corporate confidentiality by sharing internal family restructuring documents. He told them these papers proved he was taking control of my assets to protect my failing mental health. I let him finish his pathetic lie. I let the silence hang for 3 long seconds. Then I told him to read the metadata on page 4. I told him to look very closely at the tax identification numbers registered to the $15 million offshore credit lines. I watched his eyes dart down to the paper. I watched his pupils dilate as his brain struggled to process the impossible numbers printed in black and white. It was not my social security number, it was his. And right beneath it was Sarah's independent contractor tax code. I projected my voice so the entire ballroom could hear every single syllable. I told him he really should have hired a better security architect before trying to hack the founder of a cybersecurity empire. I explained the reverse encryption payload I had embedded in the dummy signature file. I explained that when Sarah authorized the final offshore transfer, my code seamlessly wiped my identity from the liability chain and hardwired their actual identities directly into the debt. I told them they did not secure a $15 million war chest to short my company. They had personally and legally borrowed $15 million from ruthless international lenders who demanded absolute immediate collateral. Sarah shoved past a waiter and snatched a copy of the contract from a nearby table. Her eyes frantically scanned the legal jargon, her breathing turning into rapid, shallow gasps. She looked at me, her face twisted in pure panic, saying that the debt did not matter because the short squeeze on my company's stock would cover the interest and yield triple the profits. She still thought she was a financial genius. She still thought she had an out. I smiled at her. I told her she was short-selling a ghost ship. I announced that I had legally transferred every single patent, every proprietary algorithm, and every core asset into an irrevocable blind trust days ago. My company holding corporation was nothing but an empty shell. The stock they were aggressively betting against was about to become completely worthless, but their margin calls were locked in. They were trapped holding $15 million in toxic unpayable debt, and their collateral was entirely non-existent. When the offshore bankers came to collect, they would be coming for Marcus and Sarah's personal assets, which I had ensured were thoroughly documented and exposed. Marcus dropped the paper. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. He turned to his senior managing partner, his voice a desperate, pathetic whisper, begging for an emergency bridge loan from the fund to cover the margin call. He pleaded that he could explain everything, that he just needed liquidity to survive the week. The senior partner did not even look at him. He was staring at his smartphone, his face a mask of absolute fury. I turned my attention to the venture capitalists in the room. I informed them that exactly 60 minutes ago, my legal team had securely transmitted a highly classified dossier directly to their board of directors, their compliance officers, and their legal counsel. The dossier contained every audio recording, every offshore routing number, and every piece of evidence proving that Marcus and Sarah were running an aggressive insider trading syndicate using their clients' capital. I told them the federal authorities were already cross-referencing the accounts. The senior partner slowly looked up from his phone. He looked at Marcus with a level of disgust usually reserved for vermin. He announced loudly for the entire room to hear that the board had just held an emergency executive vote. Marcus was officially terminated effectively immediately. His equity in the fund was frozen. His corporate access was revoked. The firm was handing his files directly to the authorities to fully cooperate with the impending federal investigation. The partners stated with absolute finality that the firm would legally annihilate anyone associated with this fraud. Marcus was completely excommunicated from the financial world. Sarah collapsed to her knees. The sleek silver dress she wore was now pooled around her on the floor as she realized the absolute totality of her ruin. She had no job. She had no marriage. She had $15 million in aggressive debt bearing her name, and she was facing federal indictment. She began to sob uncontrollably, clutching the fraudulent contracts in her hands, as if they could somehow save her from the inescapable reality of her own greed. Marcus stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes sliding on the slick cake frosting on the floor until his back hit the wall. The golden boy of Atlanta, the man who thought he could steal my empire and throw me away, was now completely destitute. He had zero assets, zero reputation, and a massive target on his back from offshore creditors who did not care about apologies. His parents sat in their chairs completely immobilized by the sheer speed and devastation of his downfall. The perfect society family was utterly shattered. I stood in the center of the ballroom looking at the wreckage. I did not feel an ounce of pity. They had conspired in the dark to take my life, my freedom, and my legacy. They had sat at my dining table and toasted to my health while actively sharpening the knives they planned to bury in my back. I had simply taken their weapons and turned them inward. The execution was flawless, the financial devastation was permanent, and the social slaughter was absolute. I looked at Marcus sinking slowly down the wall, his face buried in his trembling hands, and I felt the incredibly satisfying weight of complete unquestionable victory. Marcus stared at his trembling hands, and then slowly lifted his head to look at me. The sheer totality of his defeat was too massive for his narcissistic mind to process. The realization that he had been completely outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and publicly slaughtered by the woman he considered a naive stepping stone broke something fundamental inside his brain. The despair in his eyes rapidly morphed into something dark, primal, and incredibly dangerous. It twisted into pure, unadulterated, violent rage. He blamed me for his greed. He blamed me for his arrogance. He blamed me for his downfall. The polished, sophisticated venture capitalist vanished entirely, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. He let out a visceral, guttural scream that tore through the silent ballroom. He pushed himself off the wall, his expensive leather shoes crunching wildly over the shattered crystal and ruined cake frosting. He lunged directly toward me, his hands curled into tight, violent fists, his face contorted with the absolute intention to destroy me physically, since he could no longer destroy me financially. He wanted to break the woman who had just broken his entire empire. Several guests screamed and stepped back, terrified of the sudden eruption of violence. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step back. I stood perfectly still in my crimson dress, watching the monster reveal his true face to the entire Atlanta elite. I knew he would never reach me. Before he could close the distance, before his outstretched hands could even brush the silk of my gown, the heavy mahogany doors of the St. Regis ballroom exploded open. The sound was like a massive thunderclap shattering the tense, suffocating atmosphere. A dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical gear bearing the bold yellow letters of the FBI and the IRS stormed into the grand hall. They moved with absolute lethal precision. The glittering illusion of the high society gala was instantly brutally shattered by the harsh, uncompromising reality of federal law enforcement. Two heavily armed agents intercepted Marcus mid-stride. They hit him with the force of a freight train, driving his body violently down onto the polished hardwood floor. The impact knocked the breath completely out of his lungs. His custom-tailored tuxedo ripped at the seams as they forced his arms behind his back. An agent pressed a heavy tactical knee firmly between his shoulder blades, pinning the golden boy of Atlanta relentlessly to the ground. Marcus gasped and thrashed, trying to fight against the overwhelming physical force, but he was entirely powerless. The sound of heavy steel handcuffs clicking shut echoed loudly across the silent room. It was the sharp, undeniable sound of absolute finality. Special Agent Vance Carter, the man I had met in the dilapidated diner, stepped through the shattered ballroom doors. He wore a sharp suit and carried a briefcase looking entirely out of place among the terrified socialites, but projecting an aura of absolute command. He walked straight toward Marcus, looking down at the man writhing on the floor. Agent Carter pulled a thick stack of federal warrants from his jacket and began to read the charges in a booming, authoritative voice that carried to every corner of the grand ballroom. Marcus Sterling, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud. You are under arrest for aggressive insider trading. You are under arrest for federal tax evasion and corporate espionage. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Every single charge read aloud was a hammer blow to the Sterling family legacy. Every single charge stripped away another layer of his fake respectable facade. He was not a visionary venture capitalist. He was a common thief. He was not a loving husband. He was a federal criminal. He was not a king. He was a federal inmate. Across the room, a separate tactical team of agents converged on Sarah. She was still kneeling in the puddle of spilled champagne, clutching the fraudulent $15 million loan agreements to her chest like a shield. When the agents grabbed her arms, she began to scream hysterically. The sleek, sophisticated financial advisor completely dissolved into a panic-stricken child. She looked frantically around the room, searching for anyone to save her from the inescapable consequences of her own boundless greed. She locked eyes with David. She begged him to call a lawyer. She begged him to pay her bail. She begged him to remember their marriage and the life they had built. She screamed his name over and over again, her voice cracking with pure terror. David simply looked at her with hollow, dead eyes. He slowly turned his back and walked away, disappearing into the crowd, leaving her to face the absolute devastation of her own treachery. The agents pulled her roughly to her feet, snapping the steel cuffs around her wrists, the cold metal digging harshly into the sleek silver fabric of her designer dress. They read her the Miranda rights, marching her relentlessly toward the exit. The camera of reality shifted to Marcus's parents seated at the VIP table. The grand 40-year anniversary celebration had transformed into a brutal public execution. His mother was hyperventilating, clutching her chest and leaning heavily against the table as her perfect, curated world dissolved into an absolute nightmare. She watched in sheer, unadulterated horror as the federal agents hauled her beloved son off the floor. His father stood frozen, a statue of broken pride, watching the authorities drag his bruised, humiliated, and handcuffed son across the ballroom. The immaculate image of black excellence they had painstakingly cultivated for 4 decades was lying dead in a pile of ruined cake, shattered glass, and federal warrants. The elite guests, the powerful senators, the real estate moguls, and the wealthy socialites all watched in stunned, horrified silence. They were pulling out their smartphones, recording the catastrophic, spectacular downfall of a man who just minutes ago had demanded their applause and admiration. Nobody stepped forward to defend him. Nobody offered to call their personal attorneys. The venture capital partners had already physically distanced themselves, completely abandoning the radioactive asset that Marcus had become. They looked at Agent Carter and immediately began offering their full cooperation, desperate to avoid being dragged down into the federal abyss Marcus had created. I watched the federal agents drag Marcus past me toward the shattered ballroom doors. He looked up at me, his face bruised and smeared with dirt, his eyes burning with tears of absolute defeat. He finally realized the sheer magnitude of the trap I had built. He realized that I had coordinated this entire operation with the federal authorities, timing the arrest perfectly to coincide with his ultimate public humiliation. He realized that the documents I threw on the tables were the exact evidence the IRS needed to secure the indictment. He realized that I had not just outsmarted him, I had utterly destroyed him. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I did not offer him a parting insult. I simply looked down at him with an expression of profound glacial emptiness. He was no longer my husband. He was no longer my problem. He was just a criminal being escorted to a concrete cell. As the doors closed behind the federal agents, taking Marcus and Sarah out of my life forever, the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated the high-arched windows of the ballroom. the sirens wailed in the distance, singing the ultimate soundtrack to their demise. The ballroom remained trapped in a suffocating, stunned silence. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, spilled alcohol, and sheer panic. The empire Marcus had tried to steal from me was completely secure, locked safely away in my blind trust. The $15 million debt was chained permanently to his name, burning a hole through his non-existent future. The federal prison sentence waiting for him was absolute and inescapable. I had successfully orchestrated the total financial, legal, and social annihilation of the people who tried to bury me in the dark. I stood tall in the center of the wreckage, smoothing the vibrant red silk of my gown. I reached up and unclasped the heavy diamond necklace Marcus had given me earlier that week, letting the cold stones drop carelessly onto the floor among the shattered glass and ruined cake. I did not need his fake diamonds. I did not need his fake love. I had my freedom, my empire, and my unyielding power. I took a deep breath of the chaotic air, feeling completely reborn. The war was officially over, and I was the only one left standing. Imani, the name, tore out of his throat, raw and ragged, echoing violently off the high vaulted ceilings of the grand ballroom. The federal agents forcefully marched Marcus toward the heavy mahogany exit doors, but he fought against them, twisting his upper body in a frantic, desperate struggle. The heavy steel handcuffs dug relentlessly into his wrists. His polished leather shoes slipped frantically against the marble flooring of the lobby as he strained his neck to look back over his shoulder. His eyes were incredibly wide, manic, and filled with a pathetic, desperate pleading. He was no longer a sophisticated venture capitalist. He was a broken, terrified man, realizing that the cold, concrete walls of a federal prison were about to become his permanent reality. Imani, please, you cannot do this. I am your husband. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of his final plea hung in the air, pathetic and utterly useless. I stood in the center of the ruined ballroom, completely motionless, letting his desperate cries wash over me without a single flinch. The heavy doors swung shut behind him, cutting off his frantic screams with a sharp, echoing thud. Just beyond that threshold, illuminated by the harsh, flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers parked outside the restaurant, Sarah's legs finally gave out completely. Through the expansive glass panels of the foyer, I watched her sleek silver designer dress pool around her knees as she collapsed onto the cold, unforgiving marble floor. She wept hysterically, her carefully styled hair clinging to her tear-streaked face, her entire body shaking with the violent tremors of absolute ruin. The federal agents did not offer her a single shred of sympathy. They hauled her roughly back to her feet by her handcuffed arms, dragging her limp, defeated body out into the unforgiving Atlanta night. She had played a high-stakes game of financial terrorism, manipulating her own husband and trying to steal my empire, but the house always wins. And tonight, I was the undisputed house. Inside the ballroom, the silence was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, broken only by the faint, rhythmic dripping of melted ice from the ruined sculpture at the back of the room. Hundreds of the most powerful people in Atlanta stood completely frozen, processing the spectacular surgical dismantling of the Sterling family legacy. The senior partners of Marcus's former venture capital firm looked at me, their expressions a complex mixture of sheer terror and profound, undeniable respect. They knew they had just witnessed a masterclass in corporate warfare. They knew I had orchestrated this entire execution with a level of precision and ruthlessness that they could only dream of achieving. I was not a fragile wife they could pity or dismiss. I was an apex predator who had just protected her territory with absolute uncompromising lethality. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. They simply parted like the Red Sea as I took a slow, deliberate step forward. I looked at the VIP table where Marcus's parents remained seated. His mother was staring blankly at the doors where her golden son had just been dragged away, her hands trembling in her lap. His father looked aged, completely drained of the arrogant pride he had worn just an hour ago. and David stood in the corner of the room staring at the shattered glass on the floor, processing the terrifying but liberating truth that his blackmailer was gone forever. I felt absolutely no pity for any of them. They had fostered the greed that created this disaster. They had happily dined on the spoils of Marcus's deception. Now they would have to starve in the famine of his disgrace. The vibrant crimson silk of my custom gown swept elegantly across the floor, gliding effortlessly over the scattered documents, the shattered crystal, and the ruined cake frosting. I walked toward a pristine, untouched table near the edge of the stage. Resting perfectly in the center of the white linen tablecloth was a single crystal glass of expensive red wine. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the delicate stem, lifting the glass with steady, unwavering hands. The deep ruby liquid caught the light from the crystal chandeliers overhead, glowing with the rich, triumphant color of absolute victory. The imaginary camera of my life began to slowly pull back. It tracked smoothly away from my face, widening the frame to capture the entire breathtaking scope of the destruction. In the foreground, I stood tall, radiant, and entirely unscathed in my red dress. In the background lay the shattered remnants of Marcus's ego, the ruined anniversary celebration of his complicit parents, and the scattered useless contracts that had sealed his federal indictment. The contrast was cinematic and profoundly poetic. The kingdom they had built on lies and deception was reduced to literal ash, while I remained perfectly illuminated, holding the very essence of my reclaimed power. For 14 months they had plotted in the dark. They had laughed in the shadows. They had counted money that did not belong to them. They thought they were stripping away my life piece by piece. But as I stood there looking out over the silent, awestruck crowd, the absolute truth settled into my bones with a warm, comforting certainty. I had not lost a single thing tonight. I had not lost a loving husband because the man I married was a carefully constructed illusion, a parasite wearing a tailored suit. I had not lost a supportive family because they were nothing but a syndicate of greedy, manipulative enablers. I had not lost my company because my empire was safely locked away in a legal fortress they could never breach. I did not lose my dignity. I did not lose my sanity. I did not lose my fortune. I simply took out the trash. I had meticulously, surgically cleaned up my life, excising the toxic infection that had been quietly trying to bleed me dry. I raised the crystal glass of red wine to my lips. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the rich, complex flavors coat my tongue. It tasted like absolute liberation. It tasted like vindication. It tasted like the undeniable certainty that no one would ever dare to underestimate Imani Sterling again. I opened my eyes, looking straight ahead into the empty space where my enemies used to stand. The edges of my lips curled upward, breaking the cold, expressionless mask I had worn for weeks. A slow, genuine, radiant smile spread across my face. The heavy chains of my toxic marriage were permanently broken. The threats to my legacy were completely annihilated. The war was definitively, unequivocally over, and I had won. The greatest lesson from this journey is that your reaction to betrayal defines your future. When people you trust try to break you down, you do not have to crumble. True power lies in absolute silence and careful strategy. You must know your own worth and protect your peace at all costs. Sometimes the closest people are secretly plotting your downfall, but their toxic greed is not your destiny. You can use their malice to fuel your rebirth and build a life of undeniable strength. If you are ready to reclaim your power, hit the like and subscribe button today.